In a landmark deal, the Philippines has agreed to host more American troops in its territory.
People's Republic of China continues to advance its illegitimate claims in the West Philippine Sea.
A move seen as a counter to China.
Malinaw again yung trend, no, ng kanyang expansion at kailangan nating tugunan yon. The only way is nga military alliances natin kailangan nating gamitin.
Can this even out the power balance in the South China Sea?
Sa mga China, kinukuha nila yung Scarborough, dapat mabawi ng mga kano para sa dito sa Pilipinas.
Or will it drag the Filipino people into the superpower rivalry?
Pag dinala mo ang Amerika dito, di mas lalong pumunta yung mga kalaban nila dito.
On a February evening, somewhere in the South China Sea, an eerie green glow cut across the rosy dusk sky. It was a laser beam fired from a Chinese Coast Guard vessel, aimed at its Filipino counterpart.
Well, this laser incident is actually the second time. The first instance that they used military-grade laser was last year, June of last year. I would say it's dangerous because one, it caused temporary blindness. We still don't know whether it would be temporary or it will have a permanent effect to the vision of our Coast Guard sailors.
The Philippine vessel was en route to deliver supplies to troops stationed at the 2nd Thomas Shoal, part of the Spratly Islands. It is a group of atolls and islands claimed by both China and the Philippines. To the Filipinos, it was another act in a string of provocations by Chinese forces. On numerous occasions, there have been close calls and near misses between ships as the two nations jostle over the disputed waters.
There's very heavy waves and the strong current. The tendency is that if these two vessels are moving fast and you come so close, there's a possibility of collision. That's why there is a certain distance that you really have to keep. What is happening between the Philippine Coast Guard and the Chinese Coast Guard vessels that they have bigger vessels, we have smaller ones. It's just like driving the car. If a big truck will cut you across, of course, that's very dangerous on your part if you're a smaller car.
Last year, the Philippines filed almost 200 diplomatic complaints against aggressive Chinese actions at sea.
Laser pointing incident, of course, and the dangerous maneuvers. Every time we document that, the Philippine Coast Guard report that to the National Task Force West Philippine Sea. And then it's for the Department of Foreign Affairs to evaluate whether that particular incident would deserve to be filed for a note verbal or any diplomatic protest.
But such encounters could soon take on a different tone. A few days before the laser incident, the US and the Philippines reached a landmark agreement, a deal to increase the American military footprint in this fraught region.
That's just part of our efforts to modernize our alliance. And these efforts are especially important as the People's Republic of China continues to advance its illegitimate claims in the West Philippine Sea.
Constitutionally, foreign troops are barred from having a permanent presence in the Philippines. However, the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, allows for the rotation of the American forces on the archipelago stationed in Philippine bases.
So these are, of course, operated and is under the control of the Philippine government through the Philippine military, and therefore these are not zones of complete autonomy and freedom for US forces. So I think EDCA somehow veers away from the traditional notion that you have to have foreign bases in a country, something that is a very unpopular idea for a lot of Filipinos given our history.
Since World War II, the US and the Philippines have signed a number of defense pacts. A military bases agreement allowed the US to lease and control military sites in the Philippines. The Mutual Defense Treaty committed both countries to come to the other's aid in the event of an attack. The Visiting Forces Agreement simplified procedures for US troops to operate in the Philippines. And the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement gave the American military access to Filipino facilities. Currently under EDCA, the 5 bases that US troops can operate out of are Fort Magsaysay, Lumbia Air Base, Benito Ibuan Air Base, Antonio Bautista Air Base, and Basa Air Base. And soon there will be more. In a new agreement, the number of bases will be increased to 9.
There are 4 extra sites scattered around the Philippines. There are some in the north, there are some around Palawan, there are some further south.
Kung dadami ang presence ng US at mapaigting talaga nila yung alliance, maaring magkaroon ngayon ng mga activities na ayaw ng China na maaring makaharap talaga, no, sa kanila doon sa West Philippine Sea. Pag nangyari yun, no, doon siguro natin makikita na medyo magbago sila, at the very least maging mas maingat sila ngayon sa pagtrato sa atin. Kasi sa kanila, well, let's face it, puwersa lang ang nirerespeto nila eh. Kasama kasi yan doon sa communist ideology, no? Power comes from the barrel of the gun.
So the doctrine is to achieve a credible defense posture, and in the calculation of the military, having allies, traditional allies, its oldest ally, like the United States, is a helpful addition to its pursuit to have a posture of credible deterrence.
At the center of Sino-Filipino tensions are a group of island chains, the Scarborough Shoal and the Spratlys. The Philippines asserts that these island groups lie within its exclusive economic zone. But the Chinese also lay claim over this territory, citing the 9 dashed lines drawn on its historical maps.
Hindi yung kagaya ng ginagawa ng China na gusto niya dahil mas malaki siya at sabi niya mas matanda siya o mas marami siyang interes, dapat siya yung makakakuha ng lahat, no? Hindi naman tama 'yon, no?
Due east of the Scarborough Shoal lies the Filipino province of Zambales. Here, the turquoise waters of the South China Sea are the community's lifeblood. Fishermen like Oterio Boyamia eke a living out of what they can haul from its depths.
39 years na ako nangingisda. 2 beses na ako pumuntang Scarborough. Maraming isda doon sa Scarborough. Marami talagang parang malaking hanap buhay doon. Makapal talagang isda doon. Talagang una pumunta doon, tuwang-tuwa ako doon. Ang dami. Namiminwit lang ako niyan. Hindi na ako pumunta doon kasi may nagbabantay ng Chinese Scarborough.
In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled that the Scarborough Shoal belongs to the Philippines. But till date, Beijing has refused to recognize the tribunal's decision and Filipino sovereignty.
希望菲方船只切实尊重中方主权和权益，遵守中国的国内法和国际法，避免干扰影响中国海警在上述海域的巡航执法。
Chinese maritime forces now patrol these waters. Boyet has heard stories of Chinese intimidation tactics.
Sabi ng mga kapwa kong mangingisda, binabangga daw sila. Kahit na malaki nga yung sa amin na dinadala sa Scarborough, ay mas malano naman, mas matigas pa yung bangka nila. Talagang babangga, talagang lulubog talaga kami. Magaganda yung kinukuha kasi. Ang naiuwi nila, maliliit na isda na lang dito sa Zambales. Yun na lang po. Takot po, talagang matatakot kami. Kasi may mga baril nga sila eh. Kaya uwi ka rin kami, takot kami.
Kinokontrol na nila halos talaga yung region, no? Sarili nating mga mangisda, hindi makapamangisda, sarili nating tubig dahil pinipigilan ng China, no? Dahil doon, tingin ko, no, wala tayong talagang choice kundi talagang palakasin uli yung ating alliance, security alliance with the US para nga maproteksyonan din natin yung sarili nating interes.
For the fisherfolk along the western coast of the Philippines, they welcome the expanded American presence on their soil, a bulwark against perceived Chinese aggression.
Kampi natin ng Amerikano. Marunong din yung mga Amerikano, hindi parang ano rin sila sa atin yan, kakatulong. Hindi gaya mga Chinese, talagang ano rin tayo.
Ang kagandahan po ng may US facility na babalik dito yung mga para may protection tayo sa mga ibang gustong umangkin sa Pilipinas.
Siguro yung paglaban nila sa Chinese, sa mga China, na kinukuha nila yung Scarborough, dapat mabawi ng mga para dito sa Pilipinas.
But will the expansion of US forces torpedo relations between China and the Philippines? In the northern Philippine province of Cagayan, fishermen gather on the pier of the Apari port, trying their luck with the rod and line. Sitting at the mouth of the Cagayan River, the pier is designed to accommodate vessels up to 500 feet in length. But it has sat idle for over a decade. Floods and typhoons have silted the surrounding waters, preventing ships from docking. Reopening the port has become Governor Manuel Mamba's top priority.
Our plan is to reopen our port of Apari, our gateway to Northeast Asia, because we want Cagayan to be the international gateway of Luzon to Northeast Asia. Northeast Asia now is the economic boom of the world, with China, of course South Korea and Japan.
To rehabilitate the port, the sea floor will have to be dredged, increasing its depth from 4 to 12 meters. But this will be an expensive process with an eye-watering price tag close to $200 million. The Chinese, however, have offered to bankroll the project.
Our port is the mirror port to all ports in China. What does that mean? Neutral kami. If you want to enter China, siguro the port of Apari, if and when it is open, would be practically everything. It will become a heavy industrial port. In fact, yun naman, lahat naman. Hindi ka naman big time na investor o hindi ka naman big time na businessman sa mundo ngayon kung hindi mo mapasok ang China market, di ba?
Cagayan has been selected for a new base to host American troops under the expanded Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. This, despite Governor Mamba's misgivings. There's tension on whether closer ties with the Americans would mean alienating the Chinese.
Sa Cagayan, makaka-apekto. Sa totoo lang. No? The Port of Apari, gusto namin buksan. Sino interesado dyan? Hindi naman Amerikano. Furthermore, we see China as our biggest market of our products. We are in agriculture, fishery, and livestock. So, ito yung meron kami. I'd rather trust itong neighbor ko no, than somebody who is far, far away.
Just before the pandemic, China became the second largest foreign investor in the Philippines after Singapore. This perhaps reflects the country's pivot to China, begun under President Duterte.
Kitang-kita naman natin yung under President Duterte's term, no? Ginawa niya lahat ng pwede niyang gawin halos para dali ng Pilipinas sa China. Araw-araw sa speech niya for 4 or 5 years, lagi niyang binibenta yung China sa Pilipino na lahat ng kailangan natin nasa China.
To appease the Chinese, Duterte distanced himself from the US. He threatened to suspend defense pacts, including the Visiting Forces Agreement and the annual joint military exercise, nicknamed Balikatan, or shoulder to shoulder in Tagalog.
I want maybe in the next 2 years, my country freed of the presence of foreign military troops. I want them out. And if I have to revise or abrogate agreements, executive agreements, I will.
But all of these cautionary, I would say, measures adopted by the Duterte administration has not benefited the Philippine strategic interest, particularly in the West Philippine Sea, because Chinese incursions has not only continued but has increased and intensified, despite the gesture of cordiality being extended by the Duterte administration.
But even as President Duterte sought to cozy up to his northern neighbor, there was an anvil hanging around his neck: the status of the Scarborough Shoal. As Beijing continued to ignore the Philippines' territorial claims, domestic resentment grew.
So in a way, Philippines have basically tried everything in terms of policy, and yet Chinese behavior actually become more aggressive under a supposed accommodationist and to some, a defeatist policy of the Duterte administration.
Yung ultimate objective niya is control ng mga sea areas at saka ng mga bansa sa paligid nun. Kailangan makontrol niya yung buong area na yan para maging secure siya. And fortunately for us, tayo yung mga nakatira dyan. Gusto nila gawin lang tayong bakod.
And on the economic front, some questioned the benefits of closer Sino-Philippine relations. In the historic center of Manila, the Binondo Intramuros Bridge spans 680 meters across the Pasig River. The $69 million arch is part of a $24 billion funding and investment package promised by Beijing under the Belt and Road Initiative. But it is a promise, some observers say, that rings hollow, as many slated projects have not materialized.
Sa China, lagi niyang iniinganyo ang Pilipinas sa pamagitan ng mga pangako. Lagi niyang binubulag tayo sa kanyang magandang malaking ekonomiya at malaking market, no? Puro incentive, puro pangako, no? Pero nakita naman natin doon sa panahon ni President Duterte ay talagang hanggang pangako lang, no? Wala namang halos na nagkatotoo. Pinakamalaking partner pa rin natin ang Japan at US, no? Lalo na sa ekonomiya natin. Yun ang napala natin sa pagiging napaka-simplistic at napaka-naive na kakaibiganin mo ng China, susuklian ka niya. No? Hindi pala.
But at the provincial level, the story is perhaps different.
Sabi nga nila, promesa lang daw. Mas okay na ako kahit promesa lang, kaysa yung walang promesa. Ano ba promesa ng Amerika sa atin? At least yung promesa, it gives hope to people.
Given the decentralized nature of territorial governance in the Philippines, so local government units can actually embark on diplomatic initiatives without clearance to the national government. A lot of the local officials in provinces like Cagayan and and Palawan have embarked on cooperative ventures, for example, with China. So in a way, provinces like Palawan and Cagayan are localized sites of US-China strategic competition.
Governor Mamba fears that the US presence will drive away Chinese investors in Cagayan, a grim prospect for one of the poorest regions in the Philippines.
Kasi mawawala yung investor namin, mawawala yung plano namin, mawawala yung market namin, mawawala si China sa amin, aawayan namin yung... ang tatanga namin naman. Diba? Dahil hindi namin kaaway itong mga ito. We have intermarriages with them. We have good relations with the Chinese. During our pandemic and during our disasters, nandito yung sila. Nagpadala sila ng napakaraming bigas. Sa Amerikano, wala kami nakuha ni piso. Ang sinasabi ko lang, no, don't think for us, please. Try to get, sabi nila, most of the people, you know, ang EDCA hindi dinidiscuss, man in the streets here. Ang dinidiscuss ng tao namin dito, ilalaman nila sa chat nila araw-araw.
So there is some pushback, for example, from the local government of Cagayan that they don't want to be caught in the middle of a possible conflict between superpowers within their own environment. But I think in terms of local interest and national interest, it is quite clear that the Philippine national government can assert and simply tell the local government that you have no choice on the matter, that you will just have to follow, because we're still a unitary state. We're not a federal state. Wherein provinces like Cagayan could say no to the federal government, for example.
But on the other hand, the influx of American troops could bring its own reward. Already, Washington has pledged $82 million to improve the existing 5 bases under EDCA. However, there is a dark side to the return of US troops, one which could reopen old wounds. With the American military set to return to Philippines in larger numbers, the storied history between the two nations will once again come to the fore. It is a history that dates back to 1898, when the Philippines became a US colony. American sovereignty ended when the archipelago was briefly occupied by the Japanese in the Second World War. Following the defeat of Japan, the Philippines was granted independence in 1946.
With this ceremony, a new nation is born.
However, under the military bases agreement, the US continued to occupy 2 military outposts in the archipelago, the US Naval Base at Subic Bay and the Clark Airfield. These became important staging points during the Korean and Vietnam Wars.
Geography is destiny for a lot of countries, and on the part of the Philippines historically, it has always been a staging point for the projection of power of any major power in the region. This is why for a long time it has the biggest US military installations in the Asia Pacific with Subic and Clark, and to an extent US power projection in Asia has always included the Philippines in their calculation.
But amidst growing resentment of continued US presence and disagreement over the lease price of the facilities, the US eventually handed Clark and Subic Bay over to the Philippines by 1992, which were then converted to civilian use. Friday evening in Olongapo, a city of 200,000. It lies just beyond the gates of what was once Subic Bay Naval Base, now a free port. Dance music thrummed from the local clubs along Magsaysay Street, the hub of Olongapo's nightlife. It is a busy night for bar owner Joel Mirza. Before opening his club in 2013, he already had fond boyhood memories of this seaside city.
Dito ako nagbabakasyon kasama ng daddy ko, saka ng mami ko. Ayan, nagbi-beach. Ayun. Pinupunta namin dito kasi yung mga kapatid ng daddy ko. Nakita kasi yung buhay nung magsaysay na life siya is entertainment.
At its peak, there were over 28,000 American troops stationed in the Philippines. Their presence brought considerable economic benefits to the locals.
Sabihin na natin parang umuulan kasi ng pera nung may mga kano dito eh. That time is ang ganda eh. Laki ng kinisales namin nun. Maabot kami 100,000 for just 5 hours lang na nandun lahat yung mga kano kasi yung mga kano nun nasa 20 to 30.
It is estimated that in 1990, American troops contributed between 1.7 to 3% of the Philippines' gross national product. The Subic Bay Naval Base pumped $220 million into the local economy, providing jobs for 40,000 Filipinos. More than 150,000 people depended on income from the base. While Joel's club enjoys brisk business tonight, it is nothing compared to Olongapo's heyday.
Medyo nung nawalan yung foreigner, parang nalungkot lahat ng negosyante. Feeling nila kasi yun yung buhay ng mga bar, mga nasa magsaysay nun dahil mga kano sila ang mas higit na makakabuhay doon sa industriya.
But the American presence also brought social ills. As sleazy bars and seedy brothels proliferated in the 70s and 80s, Olongapo gained a notorious reputation as the Sin City of the Philippines.
Naku, hindi mo na maintindihan. Ang magsaysay noon ang Little America. Tapos pag ano yun, may mga ang daming mga lasing, ang daming nag-aaway, minsan may nagbabatuhan ng beer. Marami. Kaya nga palaging may patrol. May pulis din kasi ng Amerikano na umiikot-ikot. Kasi pag may gulo, dadakpin nila, kaya may patrol ang ano.
40 years ago, just barely out of her teens, Alma Bulawan found a job as a bar waitress in Olongapo. But like many young women here, she soon found herself pressured into sex work. For women's services, customers would pay what is known as a bar fine to the bar manager.
Tapos yung isa, yung bar fine na whole day, 12 hours, 24 hours ba, 12 hours, pwede ka nang hindi bumalik. Sabi ng nung management, once na waitress ka, pag once na may gustong mag-bar fine sa'yo, kailangan sumama ka. One time na binayaran ako ng Amerikano, sabi ko ayaw ko, pero mismo dumiretso na siya sa kahira para bayaran ako. Wala na akong magawa. Sumama na ako sa Amerikano. Di siyempre napapahiya talaga ako sa kasi talagang ayaw kong sumama.
By some estimates, there were around 15,000 entertainer girls working in Olongapo before the withdrawal of American troops.
Pag may barko, kikita ka ng malaki. Pag 10,000 sundalo, siyempre, piyesta sa magsaysay. Piyesta sa Olongapo.
Today, Alma works at Bukol Center, a non-profit advocating for women in the sex trade. Her own time in the scene had changed her life irrevocably. At just 24 years old, she found herself pregnant by a customer.
Nakilala ko yun sa bar talaga. Pero one time ko lang kilala yun kasi medyo hindi ako masyadong sumasama kasi one time lang kami nagkasama. Kaya hindi ako kumihingi ng anong address niya, anong niya, kahit pangalan nga eh. Kasi ang anak ko, 1987 yung pinanganak yung American.
Ameri-Asian is the term given to children of local women fathered by American soldiers. When the US military left in 1992, after the handover of Subic Bay, it was estimated that there were over 50,000 Ameri-Asians in the Philippines. Like Alma's son, many never knew their fathers.
Daming mga abandon na mga American. Sabihin, oh, you're prostitute, you're working in the bar, how should I, that's my child. Mayroon akong kasama sa trabaho at kasama sa buklod na nabuntis siya ng kano. Nung umalis na yung kano, hindi nagsusupport ganon. Tapos hinihingi niya ng suporta. Alam mong ibibigay lang, $1. Di ba? Ang saya niya. Di ba? Ang saya.
Ameri-Asians were stigmatized due to their illegitimate status. Many grew up in poverty, raised by single mothers. Because of these social harms, growing anti-American sentiments simmered in the Philippines. And when the new Visiting Forces Agreement was approved in 1999, protests erupted in the streets.
They found a name for it, which is the Visiting Forces Agreement, because it basically, indicates the forces are just visiting. But we knew for a fact that it is not merely visiting, short term, that it is actually a continuation of the U.S. presence, particularly the military presence in the Philippines. And that's why we were against it. What do you call this?
Corazon Fabros is the co-president of the International Peace Bureau, an anti-war advocacy group. She's also part of the Scrap VFA movement.
For me, it is very important. Our status and our capability as a sovereign nation. We cannot be that if we have foreign military forces in our country. If you look at the agreement itself, for sure it gives a lot of benefits and a lot of privileges to the U.S. troops. They don't need a visa to come in, they don't need permission. There are actually 21 ports around the Philippines where they can come in, during ship visits or use the airport.
The VFA also affords American troops legal protections. If an American soldier is accused of a crime, the U.S. military can request jurisdiction over the case. It also retains custody of its personnel while judicial procedures are ongoing. In the years that followed, two grim events would turn the world's eyes to Olongapo City and test the limits of the VFA. In 2005, a woman named Suzette Nicholas accused American Lance Corporal Daniel Smith of raping her. Then, in 2014, an American serviceman, Joseph Pemberton, was accused of killing Jennifer Lord, a trans woman. In both cases, citing the VFA, the U.S. refused to hand over custody of the accused to Filipino authorities before the conclusion of judicial proceedings.
It's true that the rapist was eventually convicted, but he was surrendered to the United States, and that means he has not served his sentence based on what any ordinary Filipino citizen should be undergoing.
Smith was eventually acquitted and Pemberton pardoned by President Duterte.
And therefore, most of the things that are requested by the United States, even if it's not in the interest of the Philippines, that is given to them.
We have had very high-profile cases of abuse, of rape, of even killings of Filipino citizens by U.S. soldiers. And the historical experience is that the U.S. has always protected and evaded justice because of the asymmetrical relationship between the Philippines and the United States. So this is why it's so easy to invoke such negative sentiments over U.S. presence, because of this historical trauma and negative perception over the immunity of U.S. citizens and U.S. personnel in Philippine soil.
For some, like Corazon and Alma, the expansion of US forces could once again disrupt the social fabric of the Philippines.
Ano ba ang kailangan ng mga tropa, ng mga Amerikano? Pag sila ay at Liberty Day, no? They have to have good time. And unfortunately, most of these people, when they say good time, it involves women. Huh? So we're definitely against it.
Pero kung may bars at may club, hindi maiiwasan yun. Pag nalasing yung mga kano na yan, wala. Hindi mo maiiwasan yan na walang masasaktan at walang mangyayaring katulad.
But perhaps the sins of the past can serve as lessons for the future.
Ngayon medyo mas siguro naman mas matino na or mas smart na ang mga tao na hindi madaling mangyayari mga ganon. No? At lalo ngayon dahil sa mga cellphone, mga social media, mas mahirap na mangyari ngayon yung mga nangyayari dati kasi kakalat agad
But tensions over America's return are not simply domestic. How will a bigger US military footprint change the complexion of superpower rivalry in Southeast Asia? February 2022. The Philippines and the US held their largest joint military exercise in 7 years. The war games were conducted in the final months of Rodrigo Duterte's presidency, a sharp U-turn from his previous anti-American rhetoric.
All right. So what you're gonna do? Up and down, just like that. Beautiful. So right now we are still getting...
I think a major factor for the change has been the rapidity as well as the intensity of pandemic assistance afforded by the United States. Something that the Philippines thought that China will fill in, but somehow that plan wasn't followed through. Like in terms of vaccines, in terms of other forms of pandemic assistance.
The warming US-Philippine ties continued under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., coming at a time when American and Chinese contestation intensifies.
The strategic environment of the Philippines from 2012 has drastically changed to today, 2023. Since 2012, the region has become hotter in terms of US-China competition or rivalry, right? This has intensified and has put countries like the Philippines, small states, in the middle of this superpower rivalry in the region.
Under an expanded Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the US will have access to 4 more bases in the Philippines. Proposed sites include Palawan, facing the South China Sea, and more crucially, the archipelago's closest province to Taiwan, Cagayan.
Ang mga tao hindi nila siguro alam na mahalaga din sa atin ang issue sa Taiwan kasi nga kapitbahay lang natin, apektado tayo doon sigurado. Kahit sabihin natin wala tayong kinakampihan, magkakaroon pa rin ng negative impact sa atin simply because katabi tayo. No? At kung magkaroon din ng ganon, na magkaroon ng armed conflict dyan sa Taiwan Strait, no? Siyempre, yung ekonomiya din ng lahat ng bansa na gumagamit ng katubigan na yan, apektado din.
There are 150,000 Filipinos working in Taiwan. This huge number, in any case of an intensified situation in the Strait, this might be the biggest repatriation that will likely happen. I think the Marcos administration has some calculation of the country's own national interest, and it has something to do with how do you deal with protecting your own citizens and making sure they get home in case conflict erupts in the Strait.
But there is another perspective, one that says the expansion puts the Philippines in the line of fire.
You know, this is feeding into the Western narrative that the enemy is China. But if you really think very hard about this situation. Who is profiting or who is gaining out of this situation? Who gains in billions of dollars when there is war? The one who's making a killing out of a situation of war is the United States. They sell the arms, they sell all these fighter jets and everything, including what the soldiers will wear. So for me, this kind of war, we're never the winner. The people is never the winner.
Anong pakialam natin sa pag-attack nila sa Taiwan? That is theirs. That is their race. Pero habang inuudyo ka mo yung Taiwan na maging independent at maglagay ka ng mga bases na Amerikano doon, giyera talaga yan. Whether you like it or not, because they have to defend themselves. Pag dinala mo ang Amerika dito, di mas lalong pumunta yung mga kalaban nila dito. Kaya nga ayaw natin sila para walang pupuntang kalaban.
I think that this, as small states in Southeast Asia, that we cannot simply just pull ourselves away from US-China competition. This is a major strategic and security issue facing not just the Philippines, but all the other small states.
Beijing was swift to condemn the base expansions, issuing a warning to the Philippines.
美方出于一己私利，抱着零和思维，不断在本地区加强军事部署，是在加剧地区局势紧张，危害地区和平稳定。地区国家应当对此保持警惕，避免被美裹挟利用。
I just think that they should just be more forthcoming with that, rather than wrap their rhetoric with a patronizing attitude that, oh, Philippines, your interests are going to be affected. Don't trust a lot of these foreign countries, right? But who has not behaved as a good neighbor, who has intruded into our sovereign territory, and who has continued to treat us as if we're children who could be fooled by major powers. The past 6 or 7 years, the Philippine government's approach and perspective has always been, what would China think? What would other powers think, right? And I don't know that that is the best way to protect your national interests.
Perhaps reflecting this, the Filipinos generally have a negative opinion of the Chinese. In one survey, only a third of respondents trusted China, compared to almost 9 out of 10 who trust America. But for those who oppose the presence of US troops, this is not about picking sides.
It has something to do with our sovereignty as a nation. I could compare that to a situation where you have somebody who stays in your house, you know, with all the ammunitions and all the firearms that they are going to use, you know. How on earth can you ask this visitor, which they are supposed to be, you know? How can you say, get out of my house? Historically, you know, whether we like it or not, the only way so that we can really, you know, assert that the Philippines is a sovereign nation is not to have any foreign troops in its territory.
Nonetheless, the Marcos administration's pivot to America does not mean turning its back on China. On a January trip to Beijing, the Philippine president vowed to strengthen ties with his northern neighbor.
Siyempre, kung ikaw yung presidente, gusto mong ma-maximize yung benefit mo doon sa dalawa. Pareho silang nag-o-offer eh. At kung ang interest mo ay ma-improve yung situation ng Pilipinas, kukunin mo kung ano yung makaka-benefit sa'yo. So yun yung balancing act. Kasi nga, siyempre, may offer sila pero may kapalit lagi yan.
There's always been that apprehension that every time the Philippines revitalizes or gets closer to the US, that means that there is a corresponding deterioration of its relationship with China. But as what other Southeast Asian countries have shown, that it is able to manage relationship between the two superpowers. So Philippine foreign policy and strategic policy should be clear that there is no zero-sum game here.
As the US and Philippines renew their relations, American troops could return to Subic Bay 30 years after they left. In the nearby city of Olongapo, there are many whose arms are open in welcome.
Looking forward ako sa pagbabalik nila dito sa Subic Bay Metropolitan Authority, SBMA. So sana matuloy yun para mas madagdagan pa yung pagbuboom ng mga negosyo dito sa Olongapo. Dahil lahat ng negosyo dito sa Magsaysay mabubuhay dahil din sa pagtatangkilik nila sa atin.
With the confirmation of the new base locations, the return of American troops is imminent. And although Alma is apprehensive, her story, at least, has a bittersweet ending.
Ito po yung anak ko na si Edmark. Tapos ito po yung tatay niyang nakita after 35 years. Yan po.
Last year, through DNA testing, she managed to track down her son's American father.
Hindi katulad sa ibang Amerasia o ibang bata na nagtatanong, saan ba yung tatay ko, mga ganun. Wala siya, hindi talaga siya nagtatanong. Pero natuwa naman ako sa kanya ngayon kasi, siyempre, ako hinanap ko talaga para din sa kanyang kinabukasan. Siyempre, kahit ngayon, magtanong ka dyan sa kalsada, tuwan-tuwa pa yan sila, nababalik na yung mga kano. Kasi ang feeling nila, kikita na naman sila. Dito kasi sa Olongapo, kahit may mga cases, no? Sabi na natin, may mga inabandon na Amerasian, nandun pa rin yung pagtingin ng community na malaki ang tulong ng Amerikano sa amin. Kaya nga dito sa Olongapo, lahat sila ay pro. Pro basis talaga sila. Bukod tangi lang kami ang hindi.